Hi, my dragons. This is lecture 2 for research design and analysis, and today we're going to talk about your first steps in your research and ethical research. So the first thing we're going to talk about is your research idea. So you have some idea of what you want to find out in research, okay? And it can come from anywhere. You're watching TV, you see something on TV, and you get an idea from that. Or you want to test something that might be a saying or some myth that you think is a myth to see if there's any empirical or research validity to it. So the research idea can come from anything. You can research anything that piques your curiosity. You will be testing a hypothetical construct, and as I discussed in the last tape, the hypothetical construct is something that we all agree on, we all know about, but it's not an object. You can't like pick it up, and you can't say, well, I'm going to test love in marriage. You can't like go in there and pick up a love. So it's something that we all know exists, but we have a hard time defining it, or everybody's definition might be different, okay? So there are a lot of different categories of research, and you first have to decide what kind of category of research you're going to do. You can do historical research, which is basically research about a particular area or an era or a place or a attitude or an event like a pandemic or something like that. And you would look for all of the things that were written and researched about that particular thing at that time. Archival research is another type of category. And archival research is looking at all the things that were categorized during a particular event or in a particular place, but it's really something that's hiding in plain sight. So it's up to you to decide to use the particular statistics to ferret that out. So if you want to know about, let's say you want to say, is there more crime today than there was during Prohibition? So what you'd be doing, that's my cat stretching over there. What you'd be doing is looking at police records of today and police records back in Prohibition, and you'd want to pick out a particular place so that it was the same place in two different eras. Quantitative data is where you would be manipulating variables that you have a hypothesis about and then statistically analyzing them to see what the conclusions of that research is. I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit when we talk about independent and dependent variables. But quantitative data is empirical research, and basically when you do something like, any kind of medical research, most psychological research, chemical research, biology research, all of that kind of stuff, it's going to be quantitative data. Qualitative data is when you are looking at the quality of something. It may or may not involve statistical analyses, and you're looking at how people feel about things, how people interpret things, those kinds of things. A mixed measures design is something that takes two different types of categories and puts them together. So I used to be strictly a quantitative research, okay, like nothing is true unless the data tells you it's true. And I really did shy away from qualitative data. But now my research has evolved into my favorite type of research, which is mixed measures research. So I do a quantitative and a qualitative. So, for instance, I did research on juries and how juries came to make certain decisions about different cases. So in one case in particular, I had the testimony. I did a jury which was an actual trial. It was a toxic tort. A company was accused of polluting a city. And during the testimony, so I ran 650 12-person juries. It was quite the big study. But one of the pieces of testimony involved the testimony of an epidemiologist. And so I had a verdict sheet and a compensatory damages sheet and a punitive damages sheet, which was basically all I needed for quantitative research. But I wanted to know how the jurors made their decision. What were the things that were happening in the course of the trial that persuaded them? So I included in the as a dependent measure, what were your thoughts on the testimony? And so I interviewed people, the jurors, afterwards and asked them what they thought. So I was counting before on the quantitative data to just give me a measure, like they gave so many dollars in compensatory damages and so many dollars in punitive damages, and that was a gauge of how severe they thought the damage was. as a result of the pollution. But when I went to go ask them, I'll never forget this, it was an epidemiologist who was testifying, and there were two little old ladies that were on the jury, and I said, what did you think of the testimony of, and his name was Dr. Bright. Dr. Bright, what did you think of Dr. Bright's testimony? And this lady said, honey, those words came out of his mouth like bullets. In other words, she knew it was important because of the way he was saying it, but it was rather threatening. So that shaped the research in a different way. So they gave the damage awards, not because they understood it, but because there was something about the way he said what he said. So that changed the research. And since that time, I've always included a little bit of qualitative analysis in my study. So now I favor mixed measures designs. A content analysis, and I'm going to put up a video, it's actually a 3-part video of one of my students' master's thesis. She did a content analysis, and usually a content analysis is something that you do looking at what makes up something. So she was interested in, this was her master's thesis, she was interested in, did companies, different types of companies in the United States and Canada, change their procedures on sexual harassment policies in the workplace after the Me Too movement? So was there a substantial shift? So it started out as a content analysis, basically looking at what all these different types of companies had. And she had restaurants, and she had gyms, and she had, all kinds of different types in the United States and Canada. But what she did was she did a statistical analysis between countries and between business types. So it turned her content analysis from qualitative to quantitative, in other words, making it a mixed measures content analysis, which is very rare. So that's something that's really kind of interesting right there. Usually quantitative studies take place in the lab. One of the good things about that is that you can control for a lot of extraneous variables that might come in and skew your data. We'll talk more about extraneous variables, intervening variables later on next week, okay? So a lab is good because it controls all those things that could account for what we call noise, statistical noise in your data. But they seem somewhat artificial. So instead of being in a jury at an actual courthouse, instead you're in a moot courtroom or something like that, or even worse, in a lab listening to a trial transcript. So that's a lab study. A field study is when you actually go out and immerse yourself in an experiment, and you're part of the experiment, or you're observing the experiment. So if you look at the show Candid Camera, or today we have What Would You Do If, I think that's the name of it, or What Would You Do, something like that. That is essentially a field experiment where people who are in the experiment don't realize they're in the experiment, and you're watching them and observing their behavior. So those are field experiments. They are very poor on control because just any kind of thing can happen. You don't know when that study could just really blow up in your face, but they're very realistic, okay? Another type of category is our longitudinal studies. I think the longest running one in the United States is the Framingham Heart Study, and that takes place over years or decades about changes as people age or as children grow up or things like that. So that's a really interesting kind of thing, and usually it's passed from one researcher to their apprentice or their doctoral student, and then the following person's doctoral student, etc. Cross-sectional research is when you just look at one type of research, so a convenient sample. So if you're doing research at Tiffin University, that's the most common type that you have. Students are taking a research methods class and they just want to do their study. And so they go in, they ask several classes for their responses on a questionnaire, and they'll never see them again, and they're not following them from one year to the next. They just want to know what they think about this particular thing that they're studying, okay? So that's that. So another thing that you're going to be doing when you're looking at things in your study is you're going to have a theory that you're going to test. Okay, so you have a theory about something. A theory is usually asked in the form of a question. Okay, does this happen or does that happen? Is this theory really correct? From the theory, you make statements, and those statements are hypotheses. You predict which way the data is going to go. I have a hypothesis that this is going to happen or that this is going to happen. And you test those hypotheses. So that's what you're going to do. You're going to make a question about something that you're interested in, and then you're going to create hypotheses, which are basically a prediction about how you think it'll go. And then you're going to set it up. You're going to do a design. Now, you're going to consult with your professor about the design for your particular study, and you're going to include in that your independent variables. Now, I'll put some definitions in the PowerPoint of independent variables. And sometimes textbooks and researchers give these big, long explanations about what is an independent variable and what is a dependent variable. And their explanations are really convoluted and difficult to follow. So I just want to tell you a really simple way to remember this. The independent variable is the thing that you're breaking up, okay? So you can look at anything and break it up. So let's say you're looking at gender, and you're going to look at male, female. Or you're looking at age, and you're going to look at 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 20 to 30, 31 to 41, 42 to 52, okay? 3 different age groups. So your independent variable would be age. Or you could do income and break it up that way. So anything that you can break up to compare, that's your independent variable. Your dependent variable is the thing you want to know about your independent variable. Does intelligence change over age? Is there a different level of intelligence in the north or the south? North and south, or geographic location, would be your independent variable, okay? So your independent variables are what you're breaking up, what you're comparing. Your dependent variables are what you're measuring. The secret is in how you define those things, okay? So we call those empirical realizations, or you may have heard the terms operational definition. What do you mean by intelligence? Are you going to use a scale? Are you going to use a test? What are you going to mean? So both independent and dependent variables have empirical realizations. If you're studying heart disease and you want to know heart disease in the north or the south, okay, what do you mean by heart disease? Do you mean high cholesterol? Do you mean have had a heart attack? Do you mean that you have a diagnosis of congestive heart failure? What do you mean by heart disease? And when you say what is their rate or what is their level of illness, what do you mean by level of illness? Okay, is it a particular score of cholesterol? Is it that you were hospitalized with a heart attack? Is it that you have a genetic something or other? So how you define it, or your empirical realizations / operational definitions, or something else you're going to have to decide when you do your research. How are you going to define it? What are you going to compare? And how are you going to measure it? Those are your independent variables, your dependent variables, and your empirical realizations of your independent and dependent variables. So when you call your professor to consult about how you're going to do your research, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to do qualitative research or quantitative research or content analysis or one of those other things. And then you're going to decide what you're going to compare, your independent variables, what you're going to measure, your dependent variables, and how you're going to define them, your empirical realizations of your independent and dependent variables. So that was a lot to digest, but I'll give you some stuff on the PowerPoint to make it a little easier. And the next tape will jump into ethics.